Matthew chapter 9, we're going to read from verse 9 to verse 17 and then verse 35 to the end. Matthew chapter 9, beginning at verse 9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but those who are ill. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Then John's disciples came and asked him, "How is it that we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples don't fast?" Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he's with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, then they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved." And then down to verse 35. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and illness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." So I've got a question for you this evening. It's very simple. Are you a purity problem or a purity performer? I'll ask it again and then I'll explain what I mean. Are you a purity problem or a purity performer? That is, do people think, or do you even think, when you go somewhere or when you're in a situation that you are a purity problem, you're impure, you bring shame, you bring sin, you bring immorality? We can be, for some people, a purity problem. But then there's another group, and they're the purity performers. They're the people who think they bring the purity. They're the ones who bring the religion and the respect and the lovely middle-class British values that we hold so highly. Are we a purity problem or a purity performer? Now, in today's passage, I'm sure you can see where I'm going. We see both groups, don't we? And we all know who the groups are. Group number one is the purity problem. We meet verse 9, Matthew, the tax collector. Do you see in there, chapter 9, verse 9? You've got Matthew. He's sitting at the tax collector's booth. As we know, and we learnt in Sunday school many years ago, this is worse than tax collectors today. Tax collectors are lovely people, aren't they? But in those days, it was very difficult. There was political and religious overtones to their position. On the one hand, there was a political problem. Israel was a kind of occupied nation. They'd been taken over, were being abused financially, and tax collectors were in cahoots. They were joining with the occupying forces. And so politically, they had sided with the enemy. But as well, there was religious overtones. Because these tax collectors, in siding with these people, were actually siding with unclean Gentiles. They were hobnobbing with the people they shouldn't. And so these were the kind of purity problem people. They weren't the ones that you wanted to have close to you. And there's another group there in verse 10. There's a more kind of generic term used. You see it there in verse 10. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him. You've got this other catch-all. Sometimes in other parts of the New Testament and the Gospels, it's prostitutes that are singled out particularly. But I think sinners there probably means those who would not observe the Jewish culture or could not observe the Jewish culture. It's those people who weren't in on the purity performance, but rather became purity problems. And so Jesus looks at them, and it's very interesting, isn't it? You notice there, verse 12, when Jesus looks at them, how does he talk about them? He talks about them in verse 12 as those who are ill, or perhaps in your translation, those who are sick. That is, they are people who need help. They're people who need a doctor. Now, this purity culture is fascinating. There's been lots of studies lately, hasn't it, on purity culture in America. Well, purity culture 2,000 years ago in Israel was incredibly important because the Pharisees and the religious kind of elite and kind of authorities of the day, when they read the Old Testament, they could see how God's blessing was linked to Israel's purity. So there's a sense in which in their mind, their theological framework is going, we need to be as pure as possible because the more pure we are, the more God will bless us. And so the Pharisees needed a national culture of purity. If they were good, God would bless them, or so they thought. And in creating this purity culture and creating these boundaries, the issue was actually people then became these purity problems. They became people that weren't welcome. Now, not much has changed in 2,000 years. We know that. I want to read tonight a quote that I'm sure many of you have heard. And I'm sure, like me, the first time I heard this story, I can remember where I was. I remember the conference I was in. I can remember the preacher who read out the quote, J. John. It had an incredible impact on me. Let me read the story and just remind us of actually what it means and what it feels like when you create a purity performance culture and how that affects the people we create as purity problems. So here is Philip Yancey in that very famous book, What's So Amazing About Grace, and the first page. A prostitute came to me in wretched straits, homeless, sick, unable to buy food for a 2-year-old daughter. Through sobs and tears, she told me that she'd been renting out her neighbour, 2 years old, to men interested in kinky sex. She made more renting out of her daughter for an hour than she could earn in her own on a night. She had to do it, she said, to support her own drug habit. I could hardly bear hearing their sordid story. For one thing, it made me legally liable and required to report cases of child abuse. I had no idea what to say to this woman. At last, I asked if she'd ever thought of going to a church for help. I'll never forget the look of pure, naive shock that crossed her face. Church? She cried. Why would I ever go there? I was already feeling terrible about myself. They just make me feel worse. That is a reality for most people in culture. The church creates a purity performance with strong cultural markers, and then people who are struggling with shame and guilt actually feel they are a purity problem. And you see it at play here. So you've got the purity problem, but then the second group there is the purity performers. Have a look at verse 11. We see them there. Verse 11, when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? The Pharisees, as you know, were the professional religious, the elite like me. I should have worn a suit really to say that, shouldn't I? They were the professional religious. And as I said, they wanted to be pure. And there's a sense in which surely that's a good thing, isn't it? To want to be pure, to want God to bless you, to follow the God who we said this morning is holy, holy, holy. But what they'd ended up doing as a kind of culture was ending up deciding on the laws that they could follow, that they could mark, that they could tick, that they could kind of evaluate. Because that's what you want, isn't it? In life, you want smart goals. Do they say that in the workplace still? I don't know. We want something, that is specific, measurable, attainable, and something else. I didn't have enough time to write that one down. But you want something, sorry, that's a bad joke there. You want it smart. And so that's what they did. They created smart rules. They looked at the Bible. Let's go for the things that we can do. Because when you create rules that you can keep, suddenly you've got all the power. You're on the inside and you know who's on the outside. And so what they did was they followed laws from what we now call the Old Testament, and they followed them incredibly closely. But what they did was, if I can put it like this, they followed the micro-purity laws at the expense of the macro-purity laws. So, interestingly, Jesus quotes Hosea back to them, verse 12. He says this in verse 12, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but those who are ill. And then he gets them to go back to the Bible, to Hosea, in verse 13. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. They had created a performance purity that was now attainable, but actually had lost the heart of the Bible. So we've just come out of the Sermon on the Mount, haven't we? So think about the Sermon on the Mount. How often in the Sermon on the Mount was Jesus dealing with this kind of micro-observance that had become a kind of public purity? So praying, where do you pray? Pray on the street corner. Make sure everybody can see me. If you fast, what do? Well, you look somber. Make sure everybody knows. And so they created this thing where they could now show their purity, but actually other people were left out. And so because of that, they missed the heart of the Old Testament, which is a heart of mercy. Have you ever thought of the heart of mercy in the Old Testament? I mean, it's full of laws, isn't it? I mean, you know, everybody... I met with a friend last week. I said I was going to prison, and I went into prison, and so me and my friend met, and he brought his Bible in, and a good friend of mine with Daylight Ministries is meeting with him, and I said, so you're reading the Bible? Yeah. Which part are you reading, waiting for the answer? Well, from start to finish. And then he laughs at me. He says, see, John, they gave me this Bible, and it was just in silly language. So I've got a King James version, John. I'm going to read the proper version. Brilliant. Now, to be fair to him, he did come to theology college with me. So, you know, he knows what he's doing. But yet, he is reading Genesis to the end. And he said, but I'll be honest, John, it's all of this stuff about building a tabernacle at the moment. And I know it's all really important, but I am struggling a little bit. And it is hard, isn't it? Sometimes you read all of these laws and these rules in the Old Testament, but actually, when you read it with New Testament eyes, actually you just see mercy everywhere, don't you? You see, yes, the judgment in Genesis when they fall away, but then you see Jesus coming and clothing them and talking about the one who will come and save the day. Even when, as we all struggle with some of the Old Testament RBT books, in our WhatsApp group, we're always going, aren't we? There's all this judgment, and then there's this random verse that doesn't make sense. Yeah, it's the mercy of God coming out all of the time. And they missed the mercy. They wanted people to be outside. But do you remember some of our favourite characters in the Old Testament? Think of Ruth. Ruth was the outsider. And it's because her Boaz, our glorious Boaz, had followed the laws, and he'd not kind of farmed to the edge of the fields, but had left room for gleaning, and then had left room for the aliens, as we sometimes call them, those from outside. Those acts of mercy are massively praised and picked up on in the New Testament. I think what happens with us as Christians, as with the Pharisees, and it's something we're probably all guilty of, I am guilty of it, is we're meant to be a people who build bridges of mercy, who say, come. But we end up being a people who build walls of condemnation that say, keep out. And it happens subtly and slowly. I know I've already quoted something you've heard before, so forgive me for doing it again. But there's... where did I put it? Does anybody see where I've... Too many sheets of paper this evening. There's another great story called the Life House. Have you come across this? You might have seen the video. I've shown it in a morning service before. And in this this story, it shows really powerfully what can happen to a church. It's a great modern parable. It says this: on a dangerous sea coast where shipwrecks often occur, there was once a crude little life-saving station. The building was no more than a hut, and there was only one boat, but the few devoted members kept a constant watch over the sea. With no thought for themselves, they went out day and night, tirelessly searching for the lost. Some of those who were saved and various others in the surrounding area wanted to be associated with the station and give their time, money and effort to support the work. New boats were bought and new crews trained. The little life-saving station grew. Some of these new members of the life-saving station were unhappy that the building was so crude and poorly equipped. They felt that a more comfortable place should be provided as the first refuge for those who were saved from the sea. They replaced the emergency cots with beds and put better furniture in the enlarged building. Now, the life-saving station became a popular gathering place for its members, and they decorated it beautifully and furnished it exquisitely because they used it as a sort of club. Fewer members were not interested in going to sea on life-saving missions, so they hired lifeboat crews to do this work. The life-saving motif still prevailed in the club's decoration, and there was a memorial lifeboat in the room when the club initiations were held. About this time, a large ship was wrecked off the coast, and the hired crews brought in boatloads of cold, wet, half-drowned people. They were dirty and sick, and some of them were foreigners. The beautiful new club was in chaos. Immediately, the property committee hired someone to rig up a shower because a house outside the club where victims of shipwrecks could be cleaned up before coming inside. At the next meeting, there was a split in the club membership. Most of the members wanted to stop the club's life-saving activities because they felt they were unpleasant and a hindrance to the normal social life of the club. A small number of members insisted upon life-saving as their primary purpose and pointed out that they were still called a life-saving station. The small group's members were voted down and told that if they wanted to save lives, they could begin their own life-saving station down the coast. They did. As the years went by, however, the new station experienced the same changes that had occurred to the old station. It evolved into a club, and yet another life-saving station was founded. History continued to repeat itself, and if you visit that sea coast today, you will find a number of exclusive clubs along that shore. Shipwrecks are frequent in those waters, but most of the passengers drown. Friends, Abergavenny. How many clubhouses? How many life-saving stations? And so this is something that I think deep down we all feel. If we're honest, we all are tempted to tip into that purity performers and then to create a culture where actually people aren't welcome. And what was happening here was it was all working around meals. Did you notice that the place of meals in Matthew chapter 9? Meals were incredibly important in this society. And really one of the big markers was table fellowship, whether you could eat together or not. And that showed a lot. And if you were together and you weren't meant to, then that could cause problems. That was the Pharisees' problem. The Pharisees' problem that was Jesus was eating with these people. Because eating is huge, isn't it? Eating is relationship. Coming into each other's homes, opening our homes. Hospitality is how relationships grow, really, isn't it? When you get to know someone, the step when you know you're getting to know them is when you go to a coffee together, but that's quite a new culture, isn't it? But really, it's when they come to your house for dinner, or you get invited over for dinner. It's really showing something very, very important. And so Jesus comes and he eats with them. He is saying, I am having fellowship with them. I am coming to them. The wonderful news is that Jesus came as the holy, holy, holy one, but yet he ate with those who were considered unholy, with the unclean. Why? Because he is a God of grace, a God of mercy. If you have a look down to the end of the chapter, and that great passage in verse 35 onwards, it describes Jesus' ministry. It says, so Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and illness. And I love then this verse 36, which was a verse for a year for us a few years ago, reveals the inner life of the Lord Jesus. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. That is, it was gut-wrenching. A gut-wrenching compassion. You see, Jesus looked at people and didn't see a purity problem. He definitely saw the purity performers and he challenged them. But when he saw people, he didn't see a purity problem. He saw a sheep that was harassed and helpless. He saw someone that needed help, and he saw someone for whom he came to live and die. You see, the wonderful thing about the people in the purity problem scenario here is that they come to Jesus because they realise that they're ill. They realise they're sick and they need a doctor. And Jesus is the good doctor. Whereas the purity performers, they don't need Jesus because in their own eyes they're righteous, they're pure. And the great sadness is their Messiah has come and they completely miss him. So which are you? Which am I? Am I a purity performer? Do I create barriers? Because the implication is huge. So let me give you another question that actually might be easier to answer. So are you a party people or a party pooper? Because that's what happens in the passage, isn't it? You get party people and you get party poopers. So those who were the purity problems, the one who knew how people viewed them, knew all of their struggles, came with a contrite heart and knew that they needed a doctor, when they came to Jesus and Jesus came and ate with them because he'd knocked on the door of their heart, they'd opened up and he'd come in and eaten with them. He always promises to do that. When they go in to do it, the first thing they do, and this is what I love about Matthew, he throws a dinner party. There's a good middle-class, Western, British kind of response for you, isn't it? Let's throw a dinner party because I want everybody else to meet. It's wonderful, isn't it? He throws a party. You see, when people meet Jesus in the New Testament, it's funny, sometimes he tells them, doesn't he? You get this kind of messianic secret thing going on in the Gospel sometimes, and he tells people, right, don't tell anyone. So what do? Tell everyone. They just can't help it. Because when someone meets Jesus, they rejoice, they celebrate, they love, they forgive, they give. They tell people about Jesus. The mark of a believer is that they become a party person. Now look, I'm looking out at you, and you're looking at me. I'll be honest, I'm not a party person. I can tell you some true stories. I once went to I had to do a wedding in Scotland, Beck couldn't come with me. She had to stay and look after the kids. It was too expensive for us both to go and do this wedding. So because Beck wasn't there to look after me, when I went to the wedding party in the evening, I actually took a book and sat in the corner and read my book. To Beck's great disappointment when she found out when she wasn't there, I'm going to read in the corner. I do not want to dance. Now, I'm not a party person in that sense, but as believers, we must be party people in the sense of we must be willing to tell people about Jesus. There must be something about us, that we open ourselves to others, that we eat with others, that we share table with others. That's what makes all of the difference. One of my favourite testimonies of the last few years, I know a number of you have read her testimony, Rosaria Butterfield, that's how you say it, isn't it? And the wonderful thing about her, to many in the church, she would have been seen as a purity problem, and she would have seen the church with clear cultural boundaries and actually wanted to find out what the church believed about certain things. But the way she became a Christian, in large part, was a Christian, a minister, who said to her, okay, you've got loads of questions, come for dinner. And that's what they did. They would just, I think it started through letters, and then just went regularly for dinner. And interestingly, she's gone on now to write another book, which is called something like Christianity Comes with a Key, or no, with a house key. Is that what it's called? Somebody knows? Anyway, a book about hospitality as evangelism. The idea is we should be party people, not party poopers. And that's the Pharisees, isn't it? Straight away, party poopers. They don't want them in. They did everything. I mean, we could share stories of people like Charles Simeon and the way that they tried to lock their pews and lock the building. And people become these party poopers. When people cross these lines and it starts to count, we start to feel it. We've got to be careful that we're not like these Pharisees, these party poopers. I mean, ultimately, what's the difference between a party pooper and a party person here? One knows that they need a doctor and the other doesn't. One knows that there's compassion and the other doesn't. One knows it's all of Jesus and the other doesn't. And that changes everything. It is amazing and it's a great challenge for us. And so how do we as a church, how do we as individuals, how do I go forward in our evangelism? In reading over Matthew over the summer and preparing for this week, I think the answer came to me, and I can only say it now after speaking for 25 minutes. We should be a party people. Now, if I'd said that 25 minutes ago, you wouldn't have known what I was talking about. But we should be a party people. We should be a people who are so in love with Jesus and so excited. That's why our vision statement says that we want to encourage one another to be captivated by Christ. Because when we see him and what he's done for us, we will spend time with other people, no matter what the purity problems are, and we will tell them about Jesus, because we'll become a party people. And we're going to find out more about that tonight, how we're going to do that with our young people and people outside of the church. And I want to encourage us to do that. You know, the wonderful thing is, it's not about whether you learn all the right answers, get all your apologetics right. It's not about whether we have all the best events or anything like that, is it? It's just about showing people Jesus. And when people meet Jesus, they are transformed by him.